world, if there's a clear sense of Soviet ascendancy, it has enormous political implications. So what Carter did at the NATO conference in '79 was to take defense spending. Remember in the debate with Ford, and he said the defense spending was a disgrace and he was going to take out whatever it was, 30 billion, whatever. Well, when he got in there, he realized what the Soviets were doing and had to readjust what he said. He took U.S. defense spending up at 3%. .3% of U.S. spending being equal to 4% of Russian spending because our GNP is greater. And that went from a position here, what is referred to as sufficiency. In other words, we have sufficient armaments to blow them apart, and deflected up to a position of rough equivalence or parity. And the theory was that you would cap the spending with SAL 2, which he negotiated, and then SAL 3, SAL 4, and both countries would go down together. That was the theory. Well, SAL 2, as you know, was killed. In fact, never voted upon by the Senate. President Reagan came in, and you now have spending at 10% real growth. In the last 2 years, and it's projected at 10% this year as well. Although he won't get 10, he'll probably get around 8. Now, here we have no arms control limitation treaty, a rapid increase in defense spending. Now, what are the Soviets going to do? Well, obviously, they do the same thing. And so what you have is the same equivalence, but a much higher number. Well, you say, what difference does it make, whether we spend at 3% or 10%? Well, it doesn't make any difference vis-a-vis the Soviets. It makes a difference vis-a-vis the Japanese. Because we build a B-1, they build a Honda. Okay. Now, some of you buy a Honda. I was taken from the airport to the university in a Mazda. Okay. If you go to Japan, no one's going to take you from the airport to a university in a B-1 bomber. It's just not an equivalent system. So what you have is not only the arms race implications, but you have enormous economic implications by taking your capital and your engineers, pouring them into defense, and then being non-competitive in everything else. And that's the concern that we have in Massachusetts over high technology. That the best brains are going into defense, and therefore we're going to begin to lose our edge in the high technology field. The final point, the nuclear freeze movement. The nuclear freeze movement was nowhere when Carter was president. Even though Carter raised the level of expenditures because people felt he was pro-arms control. Now, let's look at Europe. The Europeans, as you know, poured out of their homes onto the streets in 1981, angry at, of all people, the United States. And there were two issues. One was the deployment of the Pershing II, and second was the Russian deployment of the SS-20. What is ironic about all that is that both of those decisions were made under Carter. Carter was president when those two decisions were made, one by the United States, one by the Soviets. Yet nothing really happened. President Reagan came to power and they poured out in the streets. Why? Did he make a decision? No. But you had talk about limited nuclear war, winnable nuclear war. Do you remember when Secretary Haig made the comment about a demonstration nuclear shot across the bow in Europe? Well, you know, most Americans heard it and didn't pay that much attention to it unless they were going to go to Europe and had travel plans and wanted to know exactly where, you know, kind of thing. The Europeans freaked out because they saw these two behemoths engaged in nuclear war, destroying their children, and seeing how they like it. If they didn't like it, they'd stop. If they did like it, they'd do it to each other, and said no thanks. And so you had massive numbers of people turn out. You had the same thing in New York, 750,000 people. Why? Why the nuclear freeze movement wins in 8 out of 9 states? Because people basically are scared. And it's an interesting thing about nuclear war, and that is we have inside of us mechanisms that preclude us from thinking about it. Things that are very horrible, you just don't, you don't drive to work and think, now let me see, if they bombed Manhattan, what exactly would it be like? You just don't do that, and none of us do it. There's a defense mechanism. What has happened in the last 2 years is that people have been forced to break through that and to contemplate nuclear war. And all of a sudden, this whole thing grows. My wife is part of what's called Peace Links. Have you heard of that? Peace Links was set up by Dale Bumpus' wife. Dale Bumpus, the senator from Arkansas, his wife's name is Betty Bumpus. And anyway, she was accused by Senator Jeremiah Denton of Alabama that this was a communist-linked organization of Senate wives. And I mean, first of all, nobody named Betty Bumpus would be a communist, right? I mean, just by definition, any fool could figure that out. Anyway, we had a great debate on the Senate floor. He made this comment, and those of us whose wives were involved with it got up and defended our wives. And I went home and I said, we talked to my wife about it. A week later, I spoke to the National Press Club about democratic strategy. And the last question from the reporters in Washington was, is your wife a commie? And I said I didn't know, but I would ask her when I got home. So I went home and I said to my wife, Nikki, I know this is a very personal question, but after all these years, but are you a communist? And she says, no, I'm Episcopalian. So that settled the issue. My wife is involved with Peace Links, and my wife is basically, she's a very sort of modern woman, law school, who stopped to have a family, and then we'll pick it up down the road. And it's not really that involved in the sense of being a real activist. She's active a few years ago. She runs a dessert gourmet business on the side with the wife of my top aide, into desserts, which is very mainstream, you'd have to admit. She is now speaking around the country for Peace Links. Why? Because she looks as I do at our children, who range from 1 to 8, and want them to survive. It's that simple. In my view, the strongest bond that exists in human nature is not between a husband and a wife. It's between a child and a parent. And that if you threaten a child, it's very different than threatening the parent. That, we're all old enough to have some sense of our own mortality, but we don't think of those terms for our children. What President Reagan has managed to do, not himself, but some of his aides, is to raise the thought in people's minds of the incineration of their children. And so this whole thing has grown out of nowhere. It's now a major movement. We have before the committee right now the replacement for Eugene Rostow as our arms control negotiator. Eugene Rostow was my dean at law school. He was part of the people who killed SALT II. Okay, that's how conservative he is. He was sacked because he was too liberal on arms control. Who did they give us? They gave us a fellow by the name of Kenneth Edelman. I don't know whether you watched any of those hearings, but he was asked questions like, is there such a thing as winnable war? I said, never thought of it. Does the MX violate SALT II? Well, I really haven't given any thought to that either. And there were 16 different questions about the most fundamental aspects of arms control, and it really hadn't crossed his mind. That was the hearings that took place 2 weeks ago. Well, I had no real feelings about Edelman, but once I went through that, in the morning, I was staggered. I was in Boston, flew back, and I was in the committee in the afternoon. I said to him, look, under what conditions would you resign? If the president said to you, look, I don't believe in treaties with the Soviets, you can't trust them. and so clearly had no intent of having any kind of an arms control treaty, would you resign? He said, well, that could not happen. Because I went through various scenarios in which I tried to put it to him, under what conditions would you resign? Because that's the only weapon you have in the bureaucracy, is resignation. And if you're not willing to use that in pursuit of arms control, you shouldn't be in the job. If you did have a fundamental conflict, which is true of Republican and Democratic administrations. And I finally said to him, look, you go into the Oval Office, and the president looks at you and says, Kenneth, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't believe in arms control. I don't believe that you can trust the Soviets. And as long as I'm president, there's not going to be arms control signed by this nation. And you're just going to have to go around and make noises and go through the motions. But there will be no arms control while I'm president. I said to him, would you resign? He said, if I went to the Oval Office and that was said to me by the president, he would not be President Reagan. So I said, well, let's say you have a headache. In the middle of the day, you get a migraine headache, you can't work, you go home unexpectedly. You walk into your house, you go into your bedroom, there's your wife with somebody else. And your reaction is, that can't be my wife. You walk out. He has to think about the reality of his position. And if he's clear that he's not willing to exercise the threat of resignation, it means he has no leverage, because he has no constituency. You never heard of Kenneth Edelman, right? Neither did I. There's no constituency that he can then rely upon. And yet arms control is the fundamental issue. If the president's arms control speech at Eureka College, which by the way is a very good speech, was believed by the administration, what you would have is this. Because the president's START approach is better than SALT, because it's reductions, not ceilings, reductions. The problem is that the only ones who believed in that is the great fight between Haig and Weinberger. Haig won, and you got the START approach. Haig's gone. Weinberger's still there. And so in essence, those who lost the argument internally are those who are now negotiating SALT, negotiating the treaty. And that's why there's so much disbelief that there's a commitment for arms control. And so the only reason you're going to get any movement will be if the people of this country demand it. And the nuclear freeze, you can argue the technicalities of that, is basically a genuine grassroots organization that is scared stiff. And the final point I would make in it is that the president has to understand he's now dealing with Andropov, not Brezhnev. There's a major difference. Brezhnev was like a rhinoceros. He just charged straight ahead. You knew exactly where he was going, how long it took him to get there, and he never wavered one way or the other. He was the most predictable head of state you could imagine. Okay? Andropov, well, in Massachusetts I refer to him as the Bob Cousy of Soviet politics. Oscar Robinson, wasn't he? Who was, no, that was Cincinnati. Who's a famous... Oh, of course. No, he wasn't the most agile guy that ever came down. Jojo White, thank you very much. You don't deal with Jojo White the same way you deal with the rhinoceros. And you cannot assume that Andropov is going to be methodical plodding. He's going to be very clever. And what Andropov is doing in Europe is basically negotiating not with us but the Europeans. And if the German elections a month from now turn out the wrong way, you in essence have a movement towards neutralism, even a kind of pacifism in Europe, without anything being given up by the Soviets. So what they're doing is Andropov is going around Europe and his people painting the United States as warmongers who would not pass SALT II, who make all the wrong statements, and will not be flexible in arms control. And the Soviets are the true peacekeepers. which is, given Afghanistan and Poland, has got to be the most hypocritical thing that's ever been said, and yet it washes. People believe it. And why do you think they sent Bush to Europe? It's because our position was deteriorating so badly, and with the elections in Germany coming up next month, that we're in a position of basically losing the whole kit and caboodle without ever having gotten one concession from the Soviets. And that is very dangerous, because the Soviets could get the Europeans to say no deployment of Pershing II and never give up one SS-20 on their side, which is the worst of both worlds. And so all this macho talk that was supposed to scare the Soviets scared somebody, all right, scared the Europeans and the Americans. And the Soviets have been the major beneficiaries of the excessive ideology. It's got to be one of the more ironic twists of recent times. Yes.
The MX was a uproar that was basically designed to get rid of people thinking about cruise missiles, which are basically unverifiable, and would stop any start box or assault box.
The argument of the MX was not over the system, it was over the basing mode. And the problem was the so-called window vulnerability. Under SALT II, the Soviets were allowed 308 SS-18s, and each would have 10 warheads. So you were talking roughly 3,000 warheads. Without SALT II, they can build as many as they want and deploy up to 40 warheads. Let's say they deploy 30. Instead of looking at 3,000 warheads aimed at your MX, you're looking at 18,000. So when the president says there's a window of vulnerability, you're damn right there is. And it's wide open. So the argument is that there's nowhere to put a land-based system that is safe from that kind of multiple warhead targeting. The original plan that they came up with, this is pre-Reagan now, was the idea of having many silos, one missile. And the Soviets, under the theory, would not know where the missile was. Okay, and therefore, the thing was safe. Well, the problem with the theory is if you were a Soviet, what would you assume? If you had 9 silos, what would you assume? 9 warheads, sure. You'd have to. Everybody worst case scenarios. If they had 9 silos, we would have to assume 9 missiles as well. And the problem with that kind of race is it's costly to build one silo than one more warhead. So you'd have a race with us building the silos, then building the warheads, and we going bankrupt in the process. I remember when I first got to Congress, we were talking about all this, and I said to one senior member of the House, who was a Democrat, by the way, I said, look, this is ridiculous. The Soviets, if you have 9 silos, are going to have to assume 9 missiles. He said, that's not true. I said, well, how would they know it wasn't true? He said, one clear day when they have their satellites up, we'll open up all the hatches, and they can see there's only one missile. He is no longer in the Congress, as you can The second approach was President Carter's, which was the racetrack idea. And that was very simple. Remember the pictures of the MX on the ground, and then they would shuttle it between stations on the ground. And the Soviets would not know where it was because it was on the ground, obviously, and therefore could not target it. Well, that ran into problems. One was it took up all of Utah and Nevada, right? Which is fine with me, but wasn't fine with them. And the Mormon Church came out against it, which that was the end of that. It was interesting to watch the senators from Utah, who were very conservative, argue against the MX. That was one of the more delicious moments of my career. The other problem with it was simply strategic, and that is that You don't build this thing in one night. You build it over the course of whatever time it takes, so that the Soviets with satellites could simply chart the coordinates. So even if you cut it up, they know exactly where the track is. And since the track is a tunnel, all you have to do is hit any part of the tunnel, and the force would travel to the missile. So you had a basic problem. It doesn't work. Otherwise, it was a wonderful system. I'm trying to show the bipartisanship of these notions, and the third idea, which was in vogue until about a year ago, was the idea, the very simple premise, and that is the reason that 1 and 2 don't work is because we know where those missiles are, so therefore the Soviets will know. Right? That they have such advanced technical systems, the same that we do, that if they had these two options, we would know where theirs were as well. Nothing like my espionage, just good technical means. For example, an empty silo and a full silo tend to send up different signals to a satellite. So those kinds of things happen. But anyway, the theory then was the only way for the Soviets not to know where they are, they figured it out, is if we don't know where they are. And listen, I wish you would not laugh, because you spent millions of tax dollars figuring all this out, and you're laughing at what the Pentagon did. The idea is very simple, and that is to put them on airplanes. To put one MX in one 747 and simply fly them around from airport to airport. And therefore, given the air traffic controllers' problems and weather and so forth, that at no point in time would we ever be sure exactly where they were, and by definition the Soviets could have no idea where the hell they were, and therefore it was safe. That did not do very well for a couple of reasons. One was the cost, because for every, and I mentioned it also a 747, which is all right from the Seattle perspective, but it bankrupted the country. It was enormously expensive. The other problem is what is called by the Pentagon social interface. Or to put it another way, let's say you went out to the airport to meet your relatives coming in, or let's say another Democratic senator a year from now was coming in. And in came Capital Commuter Airlines, in came the MX missile. You have a social interface problem. And you can imagine what it's like at Logan Airport in Boston, or Chicago O'Hare Airport, that people get very nervous about their families coming in and those kinds of things. And you hear all the problem about traffic, air traffic noise on neighborhoods. That's nothing compared to what they would be like if they had the MX flying over their houses. So because of the social interface problem, that was discarded. The best idea that was discussed and was eliminated because of the social interface idea as well, but happens to be the best militarily, to get the fact we're a democracy, if we were a dictatorship, that the best idea is to simply put them on trucks and drive them up and down the highways. Because you'd have a situation where at no one time would anybody know where they were. The Soviets could not possibly target all of the highways like they could target airfields. And it is totally invulnerable. There's no way in hell anybody's going to know where these things are. So from a purely military, strategic, tactical perspective, it's the ideal solution. The problem is it maximizes the social interface problem. And if you are driving to Topeka, for example, and you have to pass an MX missile, you think about it. As long as they're stuck out in Wyoming and Nevada and Utah, you don't think about them, right? But if you have to pass them going to work, it's grabbing you. And you're going to think about it and think about it and think about it. Eventually you're going to give a damn that they exist. And that's not what they want. It was discarded. It happens to be by far the best idea. I think you'll eventually see this proposal come back in some modified version where they're going to use smaller missiles and probably run them up and down military installations rather than highways. There's some variation of this scheme. But the fact that the most conservative president we've had in a long, long time, could not get the MX through was for one simple reason. That is that there's no way of making an MX missile safe without an arms control treaty. Because you don't limit warheads, no land-based system can possibly be safe. And you just end up with one thing. We worry about nuclear war. And everybody talks about nuclear war as if the Soviets are going to launch a first strike against the United States, right? That's the... Our entire defense establishment is geared towards detecting a launch of ICBMs from the Soviet Union on the United States. If you go through the numbers, you basically talk about a 30-minute launch time to detonation. It varies, depends on where they're going, but basically that's it. And if you go through your mind sometime about how long it takes, A, for the satellites to detect the blast-off, for that to be transmitted to Cheyenne Mountain, the NORAD facility in Colorado, for that to go to the Pentagon, from the Pentagon to the White House, let's say it's 2 a.m. the president's sleeping, right? Which is when they do it. You do it at night when everybody's sleeping. By the time they woke up the president, by the time he realized what was going on, by the time he got down to the Oval Office, a lot of time passes. In my opinion, more than 30 minutes. Not as they do it in a test, but as they do it in the real world. Okay, how long is it going to take for the average person looking at the radar to say, oh my God, that's the real thing? It takes a while. Because you don't want to believe it. Because there have been mistakes in the past and so forth. Now, the argument is that we would know within 30 minutes and the president could launch the response. It's called launch on warning. Off they go. There's no bringing them back. The problem, however, is that if I were the Russians, that's not how I would do it. And take the chance of being destroyed. I would take a submarine offshore Delaware and launch one missile onto Washington. Okay. 8 minutes flying time. In the real world, there's no way the president would even know what hit him. By the time they picked it up on the scope, transmitted it to the Pentagon, they did it to the White House. It's gone. Everybody. Some people say that the Soviets want to destroy the United States, they should leave Washington intact. That's a philosophical argument. But that is far more likely to happen than what we're guarding against. And the other thing that we're concerned about is that all it takes is one blast, not only to wipe out the White House, but also through the electromagnetic pulse to blow out all the electrical systems in the country. So there's no way of transmitting information. The whole thing comes grinding to a halt, and there's no way of responding. Now, you remember T.K. Jones? T.K. Jones was a Seattle Boeing engineer who the president made as the civil defense chief. He was the one who said in the Los Angeles Times interview that how would you respond to all this all-out attack, and he said that what you should do is go out, dig a hole 3 feet deep, remember this, and cover it up, and it's the dirt that does it. That was this famous interview about a year ago. Well, you go through these briefings like we do, and you pick up the paper, and the Assistant Secretary of Defense is saying it's the dirt that does it. And it's an interesting perspective, and we asked him to come before the committee to explain exactly how the dirt does it. So he came, it took him 3 times to come before the committee. He had to be subpoenaed finally, under threat of subpoena, to come in and testify. And we wanted to ask him, technically how it all worked out. So we said to him, look, he was supposed to issue shovels, as you know, to everybody, so we'd all have shovels. And so, all right, World War III starts, and I'm in my office, and the sirens go off in Washington. They figure out 80 warheads will be targeted for Washington. So I run out of my office with my T.K. Jones shovel, right? Run to the mall, dig my hole 3 feet deep, and the obvious question is, and then cover it up, is how do you get back in the hole? You may argue that's very picky, but it's at the time be very important. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt that I take my staff with me, and they put the doors over me and they cover me up. Okay, a very loyal, dedicated staff. So I'm crouched there in the fetal position, right, 3 feet below ground, and one of the Soviet 25 megaton warheads hits, of course, right there in the mall and creates a crater 200 feet deep, right there, right? So I said to him, Mr. Secretary, how would I survive the fall, the 197-foot fall? He is your Undersecretary for Civil Defense, and I thought you'd like to know the kind of thinking that goes on in the Pentagon. He said that if you had an all-out nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union, all-out, total thermonuclear exchange, the Soviets would get back to pre-existing GNP in 2 to 4 years. And it would take us 6 to 12, because we were not going to have all the shovels and so forth. Now, you serve on the Foreign Relations Committee as I do, and you listen to that, it kills you. And it's that kind of talk that gets people worried about their children. Because that there could be somebody in a position of power in this country who honestly believes that we could unleash all our thermonuclear weapons, 9,000 of them, utterly destroy the Soviet Union, and maybe mankind and womankind, and who says in 2 to 4 years they'll be back to pre-existing GNP, is frightening. And what it means is, as that kind of thinking dominates government, there's an inevitability. Because you begin to think that nuclear war is possible, that it's survivable, it is in fact winnable, and once it becomes thinkable, it will eventually be thought of, and someone's going to say, we can do it. And so even though we may argue economic policy and that's important, there is only one issue that has to be settled, and that is that we and the Soviets together have to recognize that our responsibility to our children. How do you bring a child into the world, nurture them and love them, and yet not think about the fact that we both have the kinds of weapons that can wipe them out? And if you wipe out this earth, you not only wipe out ourselves, and let's say we deserve it because we didn't take action in time, but you also wipe out all the future. But there is no next generation, and they had nothing to decide. And beyond that, you wipe out all of history. All of the art, all of the great thinking is rendered meaningless because there's no one around to understand what they did. That is the implications of the arms race, and that's why, irrespective of party, or ideology, that our common humanity dictates that we care about it, get involved with it, and finally bring both countries to some sense of moral behavior. Thank you very much.